Good afternoon, welcome to Born Loved. My name is Josh, I'm going to be your host for today. Born Loved is a week of talks inviting every student here in Oxford to explore their own identity and find out more about what an identity that Jesus can offer us. The Lunchtime talks address common objections to the Christian faith, and this lunchtime, Vitale will be addressing the question, where's God when I suffer? Vince will speak for about half an hour, and then those of you with a 2 o'clock lecture are free to head off. And during that short break, a number will appear on these screens. You can text in any questions you have that have been raised by the talk. We'll have a question and answer session, and then we'll wrap things up by about 2 o'clock. So I'm really pleased to welcome Vince Vitale to come and speak to us today. Vince has an Oxford doctorate in philosophy on the problem of evil and an MPhil in theology. He also, when he was here at Oxford, he got a blue in football and boxing, so don't mess with him. Vince, would you like to come up on stage? Do you want to give him a round of applause?
That's great. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, boxing was in a previous life. When I got old and married, Joe told me it was time to take up golf. It's great to be here with you. It's great to see so many friendly faces. And it's good to see the rest of you as well. I'll just talk for about 2 hours. Is that not right? Okay. I'll talk for about 25 minutes, and then, as Josh said, we'll have a chance for some questions as well. If you have a question and we don't have a chance to get to it today, there will be cards as well at the end, and you can write down any question that you might have, and even if we don't get it to get to it today, somebody can get back in touch with reflections on that question. Also, just scattered around, just to kind of note, there's a bunch of people in black hoodies. And if you have anything you'd like to talk more about at the end of the talk or after the event's over, those in the black hoodies that say Born Loved on them would love to talk more with you and respond to some of your questions. If you're not a Christian and you're here today in a black hoodie, welcome to the team. I wasn't a Christian myself when I started my undergraduate degree. But some Christians who I met, they convinced me to start reading the Bible. And so I began to argue my way through it, and I would cross things out and add things, and I'd write BS in the margins next to the portions that I disagreed with. And Christians would walk by and they'd say, oh, why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible? And I'd say, oh, that verse makes for a great Bible study. I had that Bible for a long time, and years later I'd come across this sort of BS in the margin and say, oh, sorry, God, my bad. Things changed because when I read the Bible, even though I still had lots of questions, and I still have lots of questions, I began to fall in love with the person of Jesus Christ. I began to believe that he lived the most beautiful and the most loving life that I had ever seen, and I began to believe that he was a man worth following. But even since becoming a Christian, this question of suffering, why is there suffering? Where is God in the midst of suffering, is one that I've continued to wrestle with. Some of my reflections on this topic began with a conversation I had with my Aunt Regina at a family gathering for Christmas a number of years ago. She spoke with me about how difficult it is for her to see her son, Charles, my cousin, whom I'm very close to, suffer from a severe mental illness. In response, I began to tell Aunt Regina some of my more abstract philosophical explanations for why God might allow evils such as Charles's suffering. But after listening very graciously, my aunt turned to me and said, "But Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother." Explanations were not what my aunt needed at that moment. Sometimes we do need explanations. As a philosopher, I'm fully committed to that. But other times we just need to know that there's someone who understands what we're going through and is crying along with us. One of the most important things to me about my Christian faith is that I believe that God is not indifferent. I believe that God weeps more tears than any of us for the sufferings of this world. Some of you listening right now will engage with what I have to say primarily from an intellectual perspective. Others of you are presently in the very trenches of suffering and just need to know that there's someone who understands and cries with you. I'm going to do my best to try to be sensitive to the variety of perspectives that we'll be bringing to this topic today, but I do want to apologize in advance if anything that I say comes across as if I'm not taking seriously any real-life suffering that you're dealing with. I also want to recognize that for some of you here today, the church, the community of Christians, has been guilty of wronging you in some way and of causing you to suffer. The church is my family. I love it. I'm so grateful to be a part of it. But we make plenty of mistakes, and very often we don't live up to the love that Jesus has called us to. Please let me take just a moment to apologize on behalf of my family, the church, for any time that we have been the cause of suffering in your life. I hope that that will never be the case again, and I hope that you'll give us a second chance to earn your trust. Whatever our personal experience of suffering, one thing that we can all agree on is that some of the suffering in this world is truly horrendous. I chose to work on the problem of evil for my PhD because I think it's a serious challenge to the Christian faith, and I think religious people are kidding themselves if they don't feel the force of it. But today I'd like to share with you a few Christian approaches to this challenge that I find helpful, and I hope you will as well. A variety of other responses time to talk about in the talk today. In particular, I'm not going to responses that are based on the idea of a fall, on the sin of the first human persons. Feel free to bring up that idea or other ideas in the Q&A, but I just wanted to note that I won't be trying to cover everything today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try less frequently discussed, and one of the reasons I want to do that is the Christian sources dealing with this question are actually wider and more robust than sometimes assumed. The first approach I want to consider centers on the following observation. We're not that smart. Sometimes I forget what I'm saying right in the middle of speaking it. Sometimes I forget what I'm saying right in the middle of speaking it. You see the quick ones and then the slow ones coming in at the end there. Other times I forget to do the dishes within only seconds of my wife Jo telling me to. And one of the assumptions that's smuggled into the thought that suffering disproves the existence of God is this. If God has good reasons for allowing suffering, we should know what those reasons are. But why think that? God might have many reasons for allowing suffering in this world. And we shouldn't be at all surprised if we don't understand all of them, or even if we're not capable of understanding all of them. There's a large and growing philosophical literature on this topic, on this idea, this argument. The technical name for it is skeptical theism, but it's not a new idea. We can find it even in the Old Testament, in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah, which says this, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." When I take my dog Buster to the vet, he doesn't understand why I need to allow him to suffer the pain of a needle. And when I sit Buster down on the couch and I try to explain to him that this is important so that he doesn't get a terrible disease, I don't get very far. And that's not because of some lack of ability on my part. It's not that I'm not a good enough communicator. Buster simply isn't the sort of being who can understand why I do many of the things that I do. You can see the analogy. My ways are higher than Buster's ways. Why then should we be surprised when God's ways are higher than our ways? If God is as great as Christians claim he is, then perhaps that's precisely what we should expect. That we wouldn't be able to understand all of the decisions that he makes. As one author puts it, if you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering, then you have at the same moment a God great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing suffering that you can't understand. So as we begin to try to understand this question of why God might allow suffering, I think it's important to set the bar for success at the appropriate height. Okay, and when we do, I find myself surprised that actually there are quite a number of things that we can say, even though we shouldn't necessarily expect to be able to. I'll share just a couple more of those things, and I'd like to do so by telling you a few stories. First, a true story. My mom and dad met when they were teenagers. They worked in a supermarket, my mom as a cashier and my dad stocking the shelves. And my mom would call for price checks when she didn't need them just so she'd get to flirt with my dad. She says he had great shoulders. On their first date, they went to a black tie event on New Year's Eve in New York City, and they fell in love. On their second date, they were standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, overlooking the picturesque New York City skyline, and my dad noticed a ring on my mom's finger. So he asked about it, and she said, "Oh, that's just some ring that one of my old boyfriends gave to me. I just wear it because I think it looks nice." And he said, "Oh yeah, it is nice. Let me see it." So my mom took it off and handed it to my dad, and my dad, he hurled it off the bridge. And he watched it sink to the bottom of the Hudson River. "You're with me now. You won't be needing that anymore." And my mom loved it. Well, now that my dad had thrown my mom's ring to the bottom of the Hudson, it was only fair of him to replace it. So he asked my grandfather for my mom's hand in marriage, and my grandpa, who was just about the most intimidating person on the planet, just to give you an idea, he once snapped the neck of my brother's pet bird, PK the parakeet, with his bare hands because it wouldn't stop chirping in the room he was trying to take a nap in. That's a story for another day. Anyway, my grandpa gave the less than encouraging response of, "Well, Vinny," that's my dad, "Well, Vinny, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." "Yes, sir, Dr. Pegler, yes, sir," my dad responded. Long story short, Grandpa wound up in jail, and Dad took that as his opportunity to finally cross that bridge. He asked my mom to marry him. She said yes. They got married, and they enjoyed their young married life. But then, a number of years later, my mom and dad had the crazy idea to procreate, and to have a child. They wanted to love me and give me a good life. They realized that this was a grave decision and a grave responsibility. They realized that in having me, they would be risking the possibility of serious suffering in my life. But they hoped against it, and they were determined to love me through that suffering if it did occur. They thought about buying a new bird instead, and they considered the fact that if they had a pet bird, they wouldn't be risking nearly as much suffering, especially with Grandpa not around. Birds aren't able to suffer in some of the worst ways that human persons suffer. But my parents, they didn't want a bird. Okay, they wanted me. Even before I was born, my parents chose me, and they loved me. My mom was kind enough to carry me for all 9 months. Actually, in my case, it was only 7 months. I was born very prematurely, and when I was born, it was emergency C-section. My air got cut off, and then they rushed me away to do some tests to make sure I was okay. And they shaved one half of my head to do some of these tests. And so by the time my mom got to see me, they had shaved one half of my head, and she's there counting my fingers and my toes and just trying to make sure that I'm okay. And finally, she exclaims, "This is wonderful. He's perfect, except that he's half bald. But I'm sure we can get him some hair implants." Even though it took a 54-hour labor, I forgot to mention that detail, and even though my mom thought at this point that I was half bald, she says that it was worth it because she got me. And crazy as it sounds, she says that if she did it all over again, she would choose me again. She was willing to pay a great price for me because she couldn't have gotten me otherwise. Now, I admit that I'm a bit partial to this story. I do think it's a beautiful tale of love, and I want to suggest now that this story of procreation is importantly similar to the story of God's creation of the world that we live in. I believe that one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that God created this world, including allowing the suffering in it, is because He wanted to love me and you and all of the people who ever will live. Now, you might immediately object. You might say, even if God's intention was to love us, surely he should have created us in a better world, in a different world, in a world with less suffering. This is how we usually think. We picture ourselves in this world with all of its suffering. Then we picture ourselves in a different world, a better world with less suffering. We say, surely God should have created us in this world rather than in that world. Okay, that's a reasonable thought. But it's a thought that relies, I think, on a philosophical mistake. It relies on the assumption that it would still be me and you who would exist in that better world. And I think that that is highly controversial. Now let me explain. It was a pretty risky move that my dad made when he hurled my mom's ring off the bridge and into the Hudson. Now she loved it, but what if she hadn't? Hey, what if she had concluded that my dad was nuts and she ran back with her old boyfriend instead? What would that have meant for me? Now, I don't know who that old boyfriend was, but what if it had been Sylvester Stallone? Now, you have to admit, having Stallone as a dad would be pretty sweet. I doubt I would have had to worry much about getting bullied at school if my dad was both Rocky and Rambo. But there's one problem with wishing that things had worked out between my mom and Sylvester. I never would have existed. Maybe some other child would have existed, and maybe he wouldn't have had to worry about getting bullied at school. But part of what makes me who I am, the individual that I am, is my beginning. The parents I have, the sperm and egg that I came from, the combination of genes that's true of me. Asking why didn't God create me in a world with less suffering is similar to saying, I wish my mom had married Sylvester Stallone or someone else. I'm sure my mom and Sylvester would have had some very nice kids, but I would not have been one of them. We often wish that we could take some piece of suffering out of this world while keeping everything else the same. Okay, but that's not the way that it works. Changing anything changes everything and everyone. So here's a hypothesis. Why is there suffering in the world? Perhaps in part because God desired to create a specific community of individuals. And allowing the suffering of this world was the only way to get precisely the community he desired. A community including you and me. Had the suffering of this world been significantly different, events would have unfolded so differently that an entirely different community of people would have come to exist. Our parents never would have got together. They never would have conceived at the precise time that they did. And we never would have lived. Once again, I think that these ideas are not so original. What I'm doing here is basically theological reflection on a biblical theme. At one point, the Bible says, before God formed you in the womb, he knew you. Before you were born, he set you apart. And in another place, for God chose us in him before the creation of the world. In love, he predestined us to be adopted as his sons and daughters. Why didn't God create a better world? Well, he could have. He could have went for the best of all possible worlds. But then he couldn't have gotten these sons and daughters. And then he couldn't have gotten you. And even before you were born, he wanted to love you. Every one of you individually. Not because you're the best, not because you're the most impressive being that he possibly could have created, simply because he made you. Because you're in his image. And because his desire is for you to be his child. And his family. My cousin Charles is an amazing man. The way that he genuinely rejoices with me about my life when things go well, even though his disability means that so often he's dealing with frustration, is one of the most beautiful gifts that I've ever received. Some would say that it would have been better if Charles never existed. The world would be better overall. There would be less suffering overall. I disagree. Charles's body may be corrupted, but when I look at him, that's not at all what I see. I see a man who is exceptional in so many ways. It's because I know Charles intimately that his suffering is so frustrating to me. But it's also because I know Charles intimately that I can understand why God loves him so much and why God would be willing to accept even great costs in order to be able to give him life. For God chose Charles and loved him before the foundation of the world. One of the questions I want to raise today is, what if God chose you and the person sitting next to you? What if he desired to call each one of us into his family as well? I joked earlier about having a child being a crazy idea, but the truth is, it's a much more sobering decision than we tend to appreciate. Note that even in normal cases of procreation, parents risk a lot of suffering. Even more than that, they procreate knowing full well and for certain that one day any child they procreate will have to suffer death. And we don't usually think of having a child in this way, and rightfully so. We want to focus on the positive and the hopeful aspects of procreating and not the negative ones. But the truth remains that in having a child, parents are doing something that will without doubt cause the child they procreate to suffer death. Now, usually it is very hard to justify doing something that will undoubtedly cause another human person to die. Why then do we think that having a child is morally okay and can even be a loving and courageous thing to do? Because, I want to suggest, the child who's procreated would not have existed otherwise. In human procreation, we risk great suffering. But in doing so, we bestow on someone not just any good, but the great good of life itself. What I've been suggesting is that similarly, in creating this world, rather than in some other world, God bestowed on each one of us not just any good, but the good of life itself. What follows is that if there is good reason to think that human procreation can be an act of love, despite its great cost, then there is also good reason to think that God's creation of the world that we live in could be an act of love. Returning to my parents' story, it's important to note that when they were deciding whether to have me, they didn't just have to think about the potential suffering in my life. They also had to think about what it would cost them to have me and to raise me. Love requires sacrifice, and so my mom had me, and then she spent countless hours caring for me and sacrificing for me. In fact, when I was a young child, I wouldn't sleep unless I was holding my mom's hand. So my mom spent countless nights with a mattress pulled into my room, sort of sleeping uncomfortably with her hand sort of stretched up into my crib, holding my hand. Now, eventually, we got past that stage. It's not funny. But then one day, when I was about 6 years old, I was out on my next-door neighbor's front lawn, and I was playing American football. I was getting knocked around pretty good, and I started crying. And I went running home to my mom, who was standing on our front porch, and I was saying, "I'm not tough enough. I'm not tough enough," as I was crying. And so my mom, she did what any loving mother of a 6-year-old son would do. She positioned herself like this, and she sort of hung her nose out in the air. She looked at me lovingly, and she said, "Punch me in the nose. Punch me in the nose. You are tough enough. Punch me in the nose." And you can see the sort of family resemblance between my mom and my grandpa coming out. And at first, I just looked at her like she was crazy, and indeed she was. But she persisted. She's going, "Punch me in the nose. Punch me in the nose." And I don't know what sort of crazy psychological state I must have been in, but finally I reared back and I gave my mom, this beginning of my boxing career, I guess, I gave my mom this straight right hand to the nose. And to my astonishment, blood began to come out of my mom's nose and to go down her face. But then came one of the most gorgeous images I've ever seen, probably the most vivid image from my childhood. Through that blood came the most dazzling, radiant, just joyful smile. And my mom said, "Now get back out there." She sent me back to the game. She went inside to get herself cleaned up. Christians worship a God who, like my mom, was willing to come and suffer alongside us. A God who would not remain comfortably seated on some far-off heavenly throne as we suffered. He could not bear to. The night before Jesus died, as he wrestled with what he knew the next day would bring, he said, "My heart is sorrowful, even to death, even to the point of death." The God of the universe, the creator of all things, saying that his heart is sorrowful even to the point of death. If you've ever experienced deep depression, if you've ever thought about suicide, Jesus is right there with you. There is no depth of agony and helplessness that we can experience in this life that he doesn't understand. Ironically, it may be the famous atheist Friedrich Nietzsche who said it best. He said, "The gods justified human life by living it themselves, the only satisfactory response to the problem of suffering ever invented." Remarkably, Nietzsche never makes, at least in his writings, he never makes the connection between this line and Christianity. But as a Christian, I'd be very pleased to agree with it and then to point to the cross of Jesus Christ. Because at the cross, we see the uniqueness of the Christian response to suffering. Because only in Jesus Christ do we have a God who is loving enough to suffer with us. So far, I've been trying to help us understand why there might be suffering in a world that God created. But as I draw to a close, it's worth mentioning that that's not the only problem of suffering. There's also the problem of how we're going to deal with suffering. And that's a problem for every one of us, regardless of what we do or don't believe about God. My cousin Charles died a few years ago. He went to dinner with my Aunt Regina, and he just started choking on a bite of food at dinner. And then a minute later, he stopped breathing, and that was it. Without God to turn to, I don't know what could be more senseless than that. But as a Christian, I can't tell you how grateful I am to know, as surely as I know anything, that Charles is with the one who chose him and loved him even before he was born. He's with the one who was willing to come and suffer alongside him. And that I will see Charles again. I'll see him in a place that the Bible describes as the place where God will wipe every tear from our eyes, where there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. Before time, God chose Charles and loved him. In time, God was willing to suffer alongside Charles. At the end of time, God will set things right. And many think that the problem of suffering should push us away from God. For me, I think it's because I feel the problem of suffering so severely that I'm led to trust a God who can do something about it. Each one of us is going to deal with significant suffering in our lives, and every one of us is one day going to have to face the reality of death. That could be 60 years from now. That could be choking on a bite of chicken at dinner tonight. When suffering does come, when death does come, who will bear it with us? Who will see us through it? The final problem of evil that I want to say just a few words about concerns not the evil out in the world, but the evil in here, the evil inside each one of us. One day after you're gone, someone will be standing up, speaking about you. And after they get through all of the sort of funny stories and the embarrassing tales, what will they say? Will they say that you were one who caused suffering? Or will they say that you were one who was willing to suffer for the sake of others? I know what would have been said about me. 10 years ago, I would much rather give a bloody nose than take one for someone else. Sometimes I'd give it with a fist. Sometimes I'd give it with words behind someone's back. I deeply hurt some of the people who I was closest to, and I almost destroyed some of the most important relationships in my life because of that. The only reason that that's not who I am today is because when I was 19, someone explained to me that Jesus had died for my sins. And therefore, I no longer needed to be a slave to them. He took my guilt, my regrets, my death, so that I could be fully forgiven and so that I could step into new life with Him, so that I could be more of the person that I was created to be for the people that I cared about most, so that I could know that I was reconciled with God and would be with Him for eternity. And so I chose to follow Jesus. I chose to follow the life that He lived, a life centered on an unconditional commitment not to cause suffering, but to help others through it, no matter what the cost. Now, I know that some of you have been coming along this week. For some of you, the idea of taking that step that I took of saying, yes, Jesus, I think you are someone worth following, and I want to trust you, seems far off. I want to thank you for being here and just encourage you to continue to ask good, hard questions. But for some of you, you may be at a point where you've been thinking about this for quite a while, and you may be at a point where you think, actually, Jesus is someone worth following. He is someone that I want to put my trust in. And if that is where you're at, then I just want to offer as I close just a 1-minute prayer that you can pray along with me, just in your hearts. I'll just pray each line and I'll just leave a little silence. And if you want to affirm what I've said, then you can just affirm that yourself as a way of praying that to God. Is that all right? I understand that everyone in the room won't pray along with me. But if those who want to would join me in a minute of prayer, that would be great. Thanks so much. God, I just thank you. I thank you today that I was born loved. And that I've been loved by you every day from then until now. I thank you that you understand my suffering, that you weep with me. And I thank you that you are willing to come to live a human life to suffer alongside me. God, I know I've done wrong in my life. I know very often I haven't lived up to the love that you've called me to. I'm sorry, and I ask for your forgiveness. I want to thank you, Jesus, for dying for me so that I could be fully forgiven. I accept your sacrifice on my behalf. And Jesus, I ask you to come into my life, to remain with me always, and to make me someone who will love others as you have loved me. Amen. Thank you for listening so generously. Thank you for laughing at my jokes. I think we're just going to have a time now. Josh is going to come back up and time to give some feedback, and then I'll come back and take some questions in a bit. Thanks so much.
Why would God create any world other than the best of all possible worlds?
Really good question. And this is a question that gets a lot of discussion in the philosophical literature on the problem of evil as well. And especially sort of 40, 50 years ago, a lot of people were saying that there can't possibly be a God unless this world is the best of all possible worlds. Because if God was truly perfect, he would only create the best world that he possibly could. And what I've said, you're right to pick up on the fact that what I've said today argues against that somewhat. And that's partly because I don't see God as a sort of government official or as a sort of impartial bureaucrat who's kind of looking out over the situation, and his one goal is to maximize value, okay, to maximize economic value or whatever it is. Instead, I think that the primary characteristic of who God is that he's a God of love. And I think that when we start talking about love, what's most important is not merely loving the best or the most impressive, but actually just loving someone intrinsically for who they are, even sometimes if they're not the best. I think of an analogy like this. You walk into the pound to get a dog, and on the right is clearly the most impressive dog. Fastest, strongest, it does all the tricks on command, but you just find yourself drawn to this dog on the left, okay, who by kind of objective standards is more mediocre. But you just find yourself drawn to that dog, and you find things in that dog that you love and that you find value in, and that's the dog that you want to take home. I think of God's decision to create this world something. It's not that he couldn't have created the best of all possible worlds. If he did, I still think he would have been a good and loving God. But I don't think it's unloving for him to decide to create a world which maybe isn't the highest in terms of objective value, if his reason for doing that was because he desired to love the people of this world. I'll also just mention that in everything I've said, I haven't said anything about whether or not God has created other sorts of beings or other sorts of universes. And it may very well be that God has also created the best of all possible worlds, if there is such a thing. I just think that a loving God could also have created this sort of world because he desired to love each one of us.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question. I can see that the Christian response to suffering is comforting, but that doesn't make it true, does it? If anything, it makes me suspicious it's wishful thinking.
And I'll concede it to a certain extent. I was involved in a mission week last week in which I was giving a variety of different talks. I gave a talk on this topic. I gave a talk on why I think that there's some really good reasons for thinking the resurrection of Jesus really could have happened historically and why we have some evidence in that respect. I gave a talk on science and faith and why I think that even some discoveries in science point towards the existence of God or are very compatible with it. In this talk, I'm not trying to prove the existence of God. I'm just trying to say, here are the things that I'm committed to as a Christian. Okay, and here's the reality of suffering in our world. And are those two things compatible with one another? That in itself might not convince you that the Christian God is in fact true. But I hope that one thing it would show you is that if the Christian God is true, he can be loving. And I think that we see that most significantly in the fact that the story of the Christian faith, the central story, is one of someone coming and living a human life he didn't have to live, and suffering a human death he didn't have to suffer in order to be with us, in order to suffer alongside us, in order to offer us forgiveness for our sins. To me, that's a very loving story. And there can be a distinction between someone's love or goodness being explained and it being displayed. Just a quick kind of example, but there was a time a number of years ago where my dad was rushed to the hospital. And the doctor came out. We thought he was fine. He just had a bit of a cramp in his leg. And now the doctor came out and said, we have to go into immediate surgery. Your dad's not in a good situation. There's a good chance that he'll have to have his leg amputated. Now, we were suspicious of the doctor initially as a family. We were suspicious of his prognosis. We're thinking, does he know what he's talking about? Is he just taking the quick route rather than fighting to keep my dad's leg on, etc.? But what if What if the doctor, hypothetically, what if the doctor had come and said, and during the surgery, he's going to need a significant number of blood transfusions. And we're having trouble finding the right type of blood, but I have it, so I will make the blood transfusions for your father when I do the surgery for him. And in fact, I'll do that at the risk of my own life, because let's say he had a condition where he needed more blood in his system than most people do at all times. If that was the situation, I still might not be able to tell you in detail an explanation for why he might have to take my dad into this surgery and possibly amputate his leg. But he would have displayed his love for my father and for our family to such an extravagant extent that I would have known that I could trust him even when my explanations were not full and clear. And I think that that's what I'm trying to show with respect to the Christian God and suffering. Both that we can give some, we shouldn't expect to be able to know all of the explanations for why a God who is very beyond us might allow suffering. We nonetheless can understand some of those explanations. And most significantly, in the Christian faith, we have a God who has displayed his love for us in such an extravagant way that we can trust him even when we still have lots of questions. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks very much, Vince. Can we give a round of applause?